code, coffee. Apply patches, coffee. Fix bugs, coffee. Handle service tickets, coffee. How is this my life? I suppose I just never thought about what I was doing until one day here I was, 28, an IT professional, working in the same Swedish town I grew up in, and a chump slaving away at 3 a.m. for crap pay on a Saturday night. I had to be awake and back there again at 7, so at that point, it was looking like another all-nighter. That was when I got a phone call from my friend, Magnus, who had just gotten out of the bars. "Kurt," he slurred. "Oh, come on, man, that job's killing you. Come to this after party." I don't know what made me agree. Not exactly. I remember staring at my half-empty giant mug of coffee. I remember my brain bubbling with caffeinated fire as I thought about the frustration boiling in my chest every day of that damn job. "Sure," I said, and finally got up from the computer. The office was dark and I was alone. The moment that I stopped doing what I was supposed to be doing, the maze of shadowed cubicles became foreign and unnatural. During the day, these small spaces were crammed with busy bodies. Now, they seemed like empty tombs. I shivered as I crept silently through them. All the while, my brain kept shouting at me to go back to the light of my monitor and back to my work, where it was safe. Did some part of me know what I was about to see? The parking lot for low-level employees like myself was in the back. The air in the alley bore the chill of winter, but it was not as cold as I'd expected. I hadn't been out much in the last few months. I often darted from the building to my car to my house, and back again. We've all seen zombie movies. As techniques advanced, the look ranged from silly blue skin tones and wide eyes in old Romero films, all the way to the ghastly animated corpses in The Walking Dead. When I saw the shambling creature in the parking lot, my first thought was, wow, that's really good. And then I began wondering why someone would be dressed like that in the middle of the night. Was it a drunk cosplayer just out from some event? If so, the person within was oddly committed to the role. But as I approached, one of my senses threw me something I knew to be a huge red flag. It smelled horrific, like someone had overcooked exotic foreign spices into burning and putrefying meat. My eyes watered, and I gagged as I backed away. No way someone could go about their day smelling like that. That was when I first entertained the idea that this thing, shuffling across the parking lot, was actually what it appeared to be. One of its arms lifted, a hand slid forward, and it groaned, as if asking for something I could never give it. Horrified, yeah, near panicked, yeah, but the caffeine raging in my system pushed a simple response. I found a thick stray branch from the ground nearby and hit it in the head repeatedly, screaming all the while. It crumpled and fell, pulse thudding in my forehead rather painfully. I stared down at the thing for a moment, and then I looked around, wild-eyed, in case there were more. There were always more, right? Where had this one come from? But I didn't see any others yet. With a chance to get a good look at it, I gagged again, but not from the smell. The thing had been a woman, and under all the rotting gore, I think her hair had been dark. Bits of her skin still held an olive tone, at least those bits that had escaped the bulging black goop oozing from her veins. Her breath rasped in her opened throat. My brain took that moment to ask, what if she's actually still alive? Call someone. The police? The hospital? There'd be questions about why I'd hit her with a branch and nearly killed her. Knowing the media in my country, I'd be absolutely crucified for hurting a woman, especially one in medical need. But Magnus was going to graduate as a doctor in half a year. Calling him in a panic, I described what had happened, and he drunk drove to my work immediately while I went back inside, found a blanket, and put it over the zombified woman. Pulling to a screeching halt, Magnus got out of his car and handed me a soft white breathing mask. He already had one on himself, which was beginning to soak through from his drunken sweat. Staring at the creature on the ground from a few feet away, he shook his head and said, "Well, I've never heard of anything like this. What is she, a mutant?" "No, look at the flesh. She's rotting." "She's dead. She's a zombie." "But that's like a tentacle there," Magnus said, pointing. As much as I didn't want to stare at the putrid thing, I didn't agree. It's a strip of her flesh coming off. "Ugh, nasty in either case. Do you have a plastic tap or something?" Thinking back on a portion of the building that was under construction, I nodded, rushed back to get the blue tarp, and returned to find him poking her with the long stick. She groaned and moved slightly, and he rapped her on the head again, which knocked her silent. I was too panicked to question his drunken decision, but he wrapped her up in a tarp and put her in my trunk. "Why my trunk? And why my basement to store her in?" "Because it's your mess," Magnus told me. "If she's lucid at all, she'll tell the authorities about a man who hit her on the head in the middle of the night at your work building. They'll know it's you." Too terrified to protest, I just pushed through the moments, getting her transferred to my basement and chained up as quickly as possible. "Dusty in here," Magnus commented. And clicking the chains together with a bike lock, I told him, "I'm rarely home." And then we sealed up the basement door around the edges with plastic and tape to keep in the horrible smell of death and rotting spices. Just like that, we came to have a woman chained up in my basement. I got each of us a beer from the fridge, and then we sat in the living room whispering fearfully. What was there to do now? That woman looked and smelled dead, but she kept moving. If she was still alive, we were in a heap of trouble. If she was dead, then we'd found a real live zombie, or a mutant as Magnus insisted, and it was possible we'd become rich if we handled this right. I hadn't thought about that part. Had he? He left to get medical instruments. If she was alive, we could help her. If she was dead, we could study her. Meanwhile, I sat in the dark, wondering how the hell this had happened. I drank more than I should have, and some inner darkness drew me back down into the basement to watch her gasping and writhing movements by the light of the one naked bulb down there. Was it true that zombies wanted brains? I got a few different pieces of food and held them above her face. She held her mouth open hungrily, and then caught each piece as it dropped. Her jaw moved, and her rotted teeth mashed together, but I was uncertain whether she was actually able to chew. The food disappeared eventually, swallowed by atrophied throat muscles. The zombie drank water, too, though most of it leaked on the floor a few minutes later with a rancid odor. By the time Magnus came back, I was gently prodding it with the end of a tennis racket, trying to see under its oozing skin. "Ugh, it's nauseating, ain't it?" he asked, setting up his tools on a work table behind me. "She's rather lonesome, and a danger to our entire way of life. Imagine if she got out, if they were more like her. They might even be out there right now." He sipped the small coffee and handed me a large one. "Come on, mate. We've got work to do." We worked through the night, almost exactly like I planned to do anyway, and learned as much as we could. With gloved hands, he pried out a tooth from her groaning mouth. I held her down throughout, and he also managed to take blood, which entered the syringe already black and milky, While he examined these samples, I cut a bit of flesh from her nose, ear, and arm for testing. The zombie never stopped moving and struggling like a dumb animal that operated on instinct. All it wanted was to get free, and it never once uttered an intelligible word. Near dawn, we needed more supplies, and it was my turn to go. Heading out into the chilly gray morning, I walked down to the local grocery store, which I knew was the only place open this early. What I saw there chilled my blood far more deeply than any winter breeze. Numerous putrid zombies like the one in our basement wandered the aisles, chasing after a healthy Swedish citizens with outstretched hands. The shelves were in disarray. The ravenous creatures had torn boxes and bags and bottles down in a desperate search for sustenance. Worse, some of the decaying monsters were small, infected children. My heart sank for them, but they were beyond help now. I darted into the store just long enough to grab a canned double shot and an energy drink from the end cap right at the front, and then I ran home with all haste, chugging the double shot on the way. Magnus! I burst down into the basement and froze. He had her cheeks splayed open, and, with gloved hands and a masked face, he used metal instruments to examine the inner workings of her jaw and throat while she struggled feebly. He continued this examination without looking up. "What's wrong, Kit?" I must have looked insane, but my message was clear. "They're at the grocery store, dozens of them." That gave him pause. He put away his tools, sewed her cheek back up quickly, then threw away his gloves and mask, and joined me on a run back to the market. When we got there, nothing of the carnage I had seen remained, save for the devastated aisles. A surprisingly large percentage of the food had been taken or consumed, but it looked like everyone had gotten away safely. There was no clerk at the front counter, and no clue as to where the zombies had gone next. "Shit," Magnus said with a frown. "It's time to call the police." They wouldn't crucify me for what I had done. Not now that it had become a crisis. Totally on board with calling the police, I got on my cell phone while we walked back to the house with wary eyes on the empty street. "Yeah, hello? Something terrible has happened. There are these..." What would I say? Zombies? No, I just needed to get the cops down here to see for themselves. "There are people down here, lots of them. They're hungry, they're sick, and they're causing a disturbance." "What kind of disturbance?" the man on the other end asked. "Has anyone been hurt?" "Well, no, but you really need to get down here. We're being invaded, and we're terrified." "Crikey, mate, look!" Magnus shouted, pointing out one up ahead. It shambled slowly down the street, suddenly lit in bright orange by the cresting of the sun. "Listen," the cop on the line said with annoyance. "We can't come down there just because you don't like your neighbors. We have to avoid an incident, no matter what their behavior. There's nothing we can do about this." I stared at my phone. He hung up. But Magnus was no longer beside me. He'd run up and hit the zombie in the back of the head with a stick until it had fallen onto the sidewalk and stopped moving. "Crikey, there can't be any more, can there?" I saw them before he did, and I pointed in horror. "They're in the houses." It was true. We could both see them moving around beyond the windows that faced the street. This house, that house, the next. They were everywhere. Seeking security, he and I ran back to my home and pushed furniture up against the windows, wondering the whole time whether this was how our way of life would end. Magnus wasn't satisfied with hiding and waiting. He went down into the basement and began experimenting again, this time with an almost vicious intent to cause pain to the chained zombie woman. If he couldn't stop the hordes outside, he could certainly take out his anger on this one that we captured. When it feels like the world's ending, you just want someone to blame. I was with him for a time. until I drank that one last coffee. It wasn't even very good. Left since yesterday, the half-empty pot had chilled and staled. I just drank it anyway because I needed a fix. The pain started in my forehead, in that place I often felt my pulse, but it quickly became a spark that would have made me scream had I been able to breathe. I knew weaker versions of this sensation well, and I knew it was the coffee, but I'd seriously overdone it this time. My senses began to stutter, and all I could see across my awareness were staccato images of Magnus applying a surgical knife to the zombie's scalp, cutting into rotting skin. No, bloodied hair. No. A woman. A living woman. A terrified woman. I saw a brief flash of her olive skin, dark hair, and tears. A single frozen image on my retinas of her bleeding and wounded skin. She wasn't a zombie. They weren't zombies at all. None of them were. There was nothing wrong with them. There was something wrong with us. I'd seen people in the grocery store panicking as... Oh, God, the memories had changed too. For a single moment of clarity, I saw hungry families asking for food, hands reaching out in desperation, as other shoppers ran and screamed from what they saw as foreign abominations. I didn't know where these people came from, but we saw them as monsters. And then it was past. She was a zombie again, groaning and leaking maggots and smelling of rotted spices. Why? Why? Who or what could have done this to us? I rose and grabbed Magnus's hand to stop him from carving her any further. Stop! I don't think she's a mutant or a zombie. I think we're seeing what someone or something wants us to see. He turned his head and leaned to me, his eyes afire, his hand still clutching the knife. Oh, I suspected as much. The glamour breaks down when the pieces become separated into generic. The cells, flesh, blood, become normal under intense scrutiny. Horrified, I asked, Then why? I pointed my free hand at the results of his torture. Why this? Remember how we saw them in houses? He whispered. They're not just strangers wandering into town. They're moving here, living here. Zombie, mutant, a foreigner. A flood of them will still destroy our way of life. I let him go, and he turned back to his captive. I'd grown up here. I'd dated and made friends, built a career, followed traditions. But I hated my way of life. Work, coffee, for who? Who benefited from my long hours and mental agony? It certainly wasn't me. I turned a blunt instrument on the closest of many deserving targets. Not hard enough to kill Magnus, but enough to certainly knock him senseless. I unchained our captive, fought down nausea and revulsion, and helped her to her feet. To me, she still looked like a gibbering corpse, and I doubted we spoke each other's languages, but by God, this nightmare was going to end. She didn't bite me. I wasn't sure if she even could, what with all Magnus had done to her jaw, but I was distantly thankful in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. There was still a chance I'd hallucinated, and she actually was a zombie. I thought the nightmare was over once we limped out into daylight and found the street. I actually breathed a sigh of relief, until we came face to face with the horde. Marching down the street, the citizens came in unison, an armed vigilante ocean that kept shouting that they would enforce what the police would not. A crashing wave of zombies shuffled away from them, fleeing, and I found myself swept along. I shouted that we were being deceived, that some horrible force was holding the wool over our eyes, that we were horribly mistaken. But my former fellow citizens could not understand me. All that they heard was rasping. All that they saw was decay. I had been bitten, and now I was one of them.